Okay, so welcome everyone to this edition of Paleoflex. It's really nice to see so many people here today. Today we have Kaustubh Thirumalai from the University of Arizona, and he will be talking about methane, monsoons, and modulation of millennial-scale variability. So the format of today's seminar, so we'll have welcome and announcements for 5 minutes, followed by the talk for half an hour, followed by a moderated Q&A for 10 minutes. And then we've changed up stuff a little bit. We're going to have the after talk tea time with our speaker, and we thank Cal for being our little experiment. So this will be for half an hour. Students and postdocs are very much encouraged, as well as faculty, to stay. Then we'll have our small group discussions using breakout rooms for 15 minutes. Don't forget to send your questions via the chat to the questions Paleopex host this week, who is Chrissy. So a bit of housekeeping. So Paleopex values the participation of all folks interested in the paleosciences. Please remember to abide by our code of conduct during today's seminar. If you've somehow found yourself here without doing this, please take a moment to go back to our website and review this and sign up. Please mute yourself for your duration of your talk. This should happen automatically. And again, you can ask questions anytime by chatting to our Paleopex host via the chat. All technical issues should also go to the questions host. We're also accepting nominations, including self-nominations for our potential speaker pool, and the website is up there. We also have newly closed captions built into Zoom, and you can use the CC button at the bottom of your screen to show or hide them. If you hide them, this won't hide them for everyone, it will just hide them for you. We also have a SurveyMonkey for demographic info, which will be dropped in the chat very shortly. It's anonymous, it's optional and encouraged. So to introduce our speaker this week, we have Kaustubh Thirumalai. He did his BTech at the National Institute of Technology in Karnataka in India, followed by his master's and his PhD at the University of Texas, Austin in the US, followed by a research assistant and a postdoctoral fellow position at the University of Texas in Austin as well, followed by a postdoctoral research associate position at Brown, and he's currently an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. So I'm now going to hand over to Kaustubh for his seminar.
Okay, so I just start sharing my screen right now, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So you take it over just for me.
Okay. All right. And hopefully that's working. Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yeah, all good.
Thank you. Thanks for the verbal confirmation. I can't necessarily see the chat right now, but I was talking to the organizers a little before this, but my computer decided to totally freak out this morning. I spent a lot of time on this talk, and I woke up this morning to find that it had been deleted. So I tried to cobble together what I could, because the show must go on, and I'm really excited to share my results with all of you here. And so thanks for your time, but I would also very much appreciate your patience if you see some technical glitches or see some potentially unstructured slides. I'm just trying to get the scientific message across here. So it's not necessarily going to be as pretty as it was 24 hours ago when the talk was fine. So please bear with me. But I'm excited to be here. Thank you for thank you to the PaleoPerks organizers. I've been following PaleoPerks ever since its inception, and it's been a welcome respite in 2020. And I've seen some fantastic scientific talks, so hopefully I can do all the previous talks some justice with mine. So today I'm going to be talking about a project that was conceived during my sort of postdoc years and completed and published earlier this year. And my talk is titled Methane, Monsoons, and Modulation of Millennial-scale Variability, Climate Variability. And this the resulting paper was published in Geophysical Research Letters earlier this year. But the story is not yet done, and we've still got plenty to work on it. And it's, of course, totally up for criticism because it's only a certain hypothesis and a methodology that we've put out there. And hopefully it can be useful to your own research. I would like to point out that this research really could not have been done without the help of my collaborators, my postdoc mentor, Steve Clemens at Brown University, and my long-term collaborator, Judd Parton at the University of Texas Institute for Geophysics. I should also point out that this work was graciously supported by the National Science Foundation. Okay, let's see how this pans out. As the focus of my talk, as you saw in my title, is about methane. And all of us are the climate science community particularly is very, very concerned about the future trajectory of methane. Here's just a spate of recent publications, as you can see from Jan 2019 to July 2020. But essentially, there's a lot of interest in trying to understand what is going to happen to future methane reservoirs, and moreover, what is the trajectory of methane going to be into the future? And as you can see, I've just highlighted a couple of studies right here. So this work by Merit Turetsky and others talks about permafrost collapse that's accelerating carbon release. And I should also have pointed out that in this previous slide, this picture that you see right here is essentially permafrost thaw. You can see that these are giant evergreen trees here. So this kind of gives you the scale of this image. But due to permafrost melt, this entire land has kind of collapsed on itself. And of course, whatever methane was stored underneath has been released into the atmosphere. So there's a lot of concern in terms of these potential sequestered sources of methane and how they're going to evolve in the future, and how they're going to feed back onto an already warming climate and potentially further warm the climate as well, due to the fact that methane is a greenhouse gas. And on top of that, I should also mention here that there's been a lot of I guess, talk about certain recent papers that say there's a methane time bomb, or there's an Arctic time bomb with respect to methane, or tipping points. I'm not going to be focusing on that for the purpose of this talk. And from all I'll say on the matter is that the majority of the science and the majority of the modeling community and the methane experts don't necessarily think that a methane time bomb where all of the Arctic is going to go off and methane is going to catastrophically release into the atmosphere in the next couple of decades. That is not grounded nor agreed upon by the community. But what I am talking about here is the real potential of future global warming and ongoing warming to actually feed back onto these physical processes in the high Arctic and in the boreal latitudes. And moreover, really, it's to look into this. How is the methane concentrations in the atmosphere, how is that going to evolve? Okay, so to take a step back, let's look at methane today. And here are just some time series of methane, atmospheric methane concentrations from 2016 on the left-hand plot, and then from 1980 on the plot on the right-hand side. And as you can see, it's continuously rising. There is a seasonal cycle, but it's rising as a whole, and it seems to be accelerating. So you do have some type of intraannual to decadal scale variability, but on the whole, there seems to be a rise, and on top of that, an acceleration. So this is worrisome. And look at the values right here. Today, I just pulled this from this morning, so this is from 2020, November 5th. We're sitting at just a little under 1880 parts per billion. Okay, keep this number in mind. I'll show you that in context of how methane has evolved over the Quaternary. But essentially, today's variability is largely driven by anthropogenic activities. And this includes a host of activities that includes direct emissions because of production of greenhouse gases through various means. but also through things like wastewater treatment plants, agriculture, dairy culture in particular. So the majority of this trend is attributable directly to human activities. But in terms of the previous studies that I showed you, there's a worry that the potential for natural extreme variability in methane concentrations can essentially add to this or complicate our potential understanding to anticipate future methane variations. And so to take a step back, we need to really understand what are the drivers of the natural modes of variability of atmospheric methane. And towards that, the dominant source of methane is through wetlands today. And I will also point out, this is just the same plot from before, but I will also point out that methane is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. And it contributes to somewhere around 17% of the total radiative forcing due to greenhouse gases. So it's a significant amount. And methane, on top of that, basically gets oxidized back into CO2. So it's kind of a double whammy in the sense of future warming. So people are very interested to try and see where we're headed into and what kind of surprises are in store. But largely, the major natural mode of variability is going to be due to wetlands and variations in wetlands. So I have a plot right here from this excellent paper by Guo et al. And as you can see right there, there's basically a plot of the overall wetland distribution. And so this goes from 0 to 10 in the bluish colors, cool colors, all the way to 90 to 100 in the red colors right here. And so you can see that there's a lot of concentration of the reds right up here, maybe some here in the high Arctic in Canada and Alaska, but also all over the tropics as well, that you can see consistent wetland distribution. And what are wetlands? Basically, I'm not a wetland scientist, so disclaimer right there, but essentially these are areas that have a high water table and basically have plants and animals that are used to this, and they are conducive for high methane production as a source. And right here, just below that, is the potential CH4 emissions. This is from a simulation, but it's a simulation based on modern data for the present day spatial emissions of methane from these wetlands. And so you can see right here that there's somewhat of a nice correlation between where we have the wetlands and how much methane is being emitted. So this is in the units of grams per meter square per year. So it's a flux in terms of how much is being emitted on the annual scale. And then finally, right here, these are 3 different estimates of the release of methane in the different colors. These are different types of estimates. Some of them are top-down estimates. Some of them are bottom-up estimates. But essentially, they are plotted here with respect to latitude. So the northern hemisphere, the Arctic is up here, and the sort of the southern hemisphere subtropics, 40 to 50 south, is down here. And essentially, all of these 3 different types of estimates, they agree that the majority of methane emissions come from the tropics right here. And mind you, they're coming from both the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere tropics, but also the boreal forest latitudes right here, which we're seeing in wetland distribution all over in the northern latitudes right here. Okay, so this being said, this is kind of the major sources of natural methane variability. And so on this next slide, what I'm going to show you is, if I can get to work. Oops. Yeah, so here we go. This is the atmospheric methane concentration reconstructed from ancient atmospheres that are trapped inside ice cores. And so this particular figure shows you the methane concentrations from the Antarctic ice cores that go back about 800,000 years or so. And if for a second, if you'll ignore all of this and just look at the values right here, the topmost value, something like this, maybe right here, is on the order of about 800 parts per billion of methane. It's gotten cut off here, so I apologize for that. but roughly about 800 parts per billion. There's a lot of different modes of variability that you see here, which is obviously the focus of this talk. But for now, let's just talk about it in terms of this 100,000-year cycles that are talking about the glacial to interglacial variations of methane, atmospheric methane. And superimposed over that, we see this sort of orbital scale beat as well that happens on the order of about anywhere from 20,000 to 40,000 years. And finally, you can also see kind of the fuzzy little peaks up and down superimposed on top of those orbital variations, like right here, these sort of changes. And those are the millennial scale variations. But regardless of all of these variations in the past 800,000 years, you can very clearly see that we are currently up here at close to 1880 today. And so the amount at which we've increased atmospheric methane, especially relative to the pre-industrial period, which is somewhere right here, is more than 150%. Let that sink in. This is another major reason why people are worried about methane, atmospheric methane in the atmosphere. And we're given how much we're pushing the system. But again, the bottom line is that we have this fantastic record of actually sampling ancient atmospheric bubbles that are trapped inside ice, that we can directly quantify and estimate ancient methane concentrations. So we have this phenomenally well-resolved record, and mind you, methane measurements are better resolved in ice cores than even carbon dioxide measurements. So these are very high resolution reconstructions on the order of 1 to a couple centuries in most of the domain. But here's this amazing record that we have to try and look into the past to maybe perhaps understand what is possible under warmer climates or under abrupt climate change, or according to these different types of timescales and how these timescales talk to each other. So the focus of this talk is really going to be looking at how what we can learn rather from the past record of atmospheric methane, and essentially what can the past record really reveal about the controls of the sources of methane in the past. Okay, so I talked about the the different types of timescales that are available to us, or that we see in terms of the variability of methane. And dominantly, to my eye at least, I'm going to quantify what I'm seeing right now later on in the talk, but to my eye at least, you can see this sort of sawtooth structure that's very familiar to many of us, that describes the glacial interglacial variability of methane. So this is on the order of about 100,000-year timescales. And on top of that, like I mentioned, you can kind of see maybe these beats right here. And these kind of beats are on the precessional to obliquity timescales. We'll talk about what those are, but essentially these are timescales greater than about 19,000 years and less than 100,000 years that correlate with changes in the Earth's background orbital configurations. Okay, so those are two types of timescales that we've looked at. One is the glacial interglacial, and one is the orbital. And finally, the type of variability that this talk is going to be focusing on are these sort of sharp changes right here. And you can't really see this in the context of this giant record, but that's kind of the point, is that these sharp changes are fast and might be less short-lived than the overall longer-term changes. So you can see these right here where you have increases, but you also have sharp decreases as well. And that is the millennial-scale variability, the band of millennial-scale timescale. So basically, we're looking at variability on the order of 1,000 years to 10,000 years. So it's that short band, much shorter than the orbital scale, as well as the glacial to interglacial timescales as well. And that's going to be what we're going to focus on, is the millennial scale variability. There's a lot of interest in the millennial scale variability because these might potentially be analogs to abrupt climate changes that might happen in the future as well. And so what we're trying to ask here is, what can we understand and learn that might be potentially new insights in terms of focusing on the millennial scale variability in this long-term context of methane. But let's take a step back here and try to see what is millennial scale variability in the first place. So this is a classic paper by Dansgaard and Oeschger and others. This comes from a 1984 compilation, but they were basically drilling a lot of ice cores in the 70s and late 60s and a lot of the 70s. And essentially, people were trying to look at the oxygen isotope composition of the ice as you go further back in time. And the ice cores give you very, very nice, nicely resolved, highly resolved variability going back in time, but they're also really well dated. You can actually have very nice models, age models, that tell you exactly where you are in time. And essentially what Dansgaard, Oeschger, and others basically found was that when you start going back in time beyond the current interglacial, past the deglaciation and into the last ice age, essentially they were able to find that the oxygen isotope record shows these dramatic variations on the order of about 5 per mil or so. And to those of you who may not be familiar, that translates to roughly warming on the order of 10 degrees C. Huge, huge changes. And they were able to correlate these sort of excursions across Greenland. Essentially, they were able to show that there are periods of rapid warming and then slow cooling. Rapid warming and slow cooling. And mind you, rapid and slow are relative terms here, but roughly the rapidity of that warming is on the order of decades to centuries. But these millennial scale events seem to be long-lived over about 1,000 to 2,000 and sometimes longer timescales as well, but firmly in that millennial scale band. And so they were able to outline and correlate different types of these so-called DO events, the Dansgaard-Oeschger events, and people give them numbers. So there's DO event 1, 2, 3, and so on. But this imprint of millennial scale variability was quite shocking at the time, because how can we explain these rapid fluctuations that onset rather quickly? And these DO events became a whole host of study, a whole field of study in the past 30 years, and several of us are still working on it, and the causes are still highly debated, but we've come a long way since Dansgaard and Oeschger and others worked on this problem, and we have some understanding of how these mechanisms actually can persist. But essentially, this sort of gave rise to the study of millennial scale variations, and people were able to find millennial scale variability in different types of archives, in speleothems, in marine sediment cores, in various different types of archives. And fast forward a couple years later, here is a famous paper by Hartmut Heinrich in 1987, published in Quaternary Research, where Heinrich essentially looked at a bunch of sediment cores up in the North Atlantic. Here's Greenland, Europe, and Canada. And Heinrich was able to show that there are basically episodic surges of ice that are basically reconstructed by ice-rafted debris in these cores, and that these episodic excursions of ice-rafted debris, that we can correlate the lithologies to essentially different parts of the Northern Hemisphere ice sheet, when the ice sheet existed. So this is on the same timescale as those DO events, but they're interspersed with the DO events, and these are called Heinrich events now in hindsight. And these are basically these episodic surges of ice into the North Atlantic. And this might sound familiar to you if you've seen the movie Day After Tomorrow, but essentially this is not an unrealistic scenario or an unheard of scenario in the future, where you might have slow melt, gradual melt from the Greenland ice sheet due to current ongoing warming, and essentially play havoc into the oceanic circulation that exists in the North Atlantic. But Heinrich was the first one to sort of piece this together and correlate them across multiple different cores in the North Atlantic. So both of these Heinrich events and these DO events are essentially firmly in the place of what we're calling what is known as millennial-scale variability. And so very excitingly, in the late 90s, and this is a compilation by Blunier and Brook in 2001, what people were able to show from the ice cores from both the Greenland and Antarctic ice cores was that there are some really, really interesting correspondences between these d'O events, which you can see right here, and the Heinrich events that are right here. And they're all numbered and labeled in Greenland in the Northern Hemisphere and Antarctica. So the Antarctic ice core record seems to have these warming excursions, warmer is up, cooler is down, that corresponded to the cool time periods in Greenland, just prior to rapid onsets of warming in Greenland. And the way that they were able to actually piece this together was because of methane. And the reason is that these two cores are on their own different timescales and they have their own uncertainties in time. But we know that methane is a well-mixed greenhouse gas. And so it is totally a reasonable assumption to say that the methane concentrations in Antarctica and Greenland should be exactly the same. So they were able to line up the methane reconstructions in Antarctica and in Greenland, and then were able to look at the phasing or the relative leads and lags of millennial scale climate variability in Antarctica and Greenland. And one thing that they were noticing as these records were coming out, at least in the methane reconstructions, was that there appeared to be a trend. If you notice right here, there appears to be a trend here. Oops, sorry, I skipped that. But this is the same plot right here from this paper by Ed Brook and others in Science in 1996. But essentially, over the last glacial interglacial cycle, they were able to show that methane right here and the correlation of methane in Antarctica, this is Vostok is from Antarctica, and GISP2 is Greenland. Here is just the Greenland ice core delta 18O, so warmer is up and cooler is down. And this is insolation. And so essentially what they noticed is that the variation in insolation, incoming solar radiation, and these variations are strongly driven by changes in the Earth's orbital configuration. What they were able to show is that there appears to be some type of correlation between these sort of millennial scale changes in methane and insolation peaks. So what they're seeing is right here. That's what they inferred and what was available to them at that time. So low insolation, low millennial scale methane variability, higher insolation, higher millennial scale methane variability. And essentially in this paper, they posited that insolation may have modulated the effects of interstadial climate change or millennial scale climate change on the terrestrial biosphere. So now they're trying to connect these timescales. And essentially what they actually hypothesized was that the longer term slow variations in incoming solar radiation that happen on the 20,000 year to 41,000 year timescales can actually modulate or control these episodic releases, the millennial scale releases in methane. So this was their assertion at the time, and they worked with whatever data that they had. Okay, but at the time, what were they thinking was the driver of this methane variability? And towards that, we got to go back a little further back in time. This is back in 1990, where here's the first record of atmospheric methane over the past glacial interglacial cycle. So this is, you can see it's a coarser resolution reconstruction. Things get higher and higher resolved as we go further in time. But this was the first paper to kind of show that, hey, look at these sort of significant variations in methane, atmospheric methane, as you go back into the glacial cycle. And what these authors did, they used a model of precipitation. This was actually a simulation from Kutzbach and others. And they were able to show that these South Asian rainfall variations seem to correspond quite a bit to these methane excursions that they reconstructed in the ice cores. And given that modern methane variations are naturally controlled by wetland formation, essentially they put out the hypothesis to say that methane over the Pleistocene is really driven by low latitude monsoons. And at the time, they didn't necessarily have high resolution reconstruction of Asian monsoon variability. This is for South Asia right here. And so that's why they used a simulation that was forced with background orbital conditions. And they essentially inferred, due to this sort of orbital scale correspondences, that methane is being driven by low latitude monsoons. And they actually quote here that we therefore propose that the monsoon circulation could have had a principal role in controlling paleomethane concentration through variations of low latitude wetland areas. And so I'm just going to go back a slide very quickly, if it will allow me. Probably not. It doesn't seem to like that. Oh, here we go. So this is where they actually, Ed Brooke and others, built upon that research and said that insolation may have modulated the effects of millennial scale climate change on the terrestrial biosphere. So again, the terrestrial biosphere aspect, they're alluding towards wetlands in this paper. Okay, so this is where it stems from. Now, finally, fast forward 30 years, we do have very, very nicely detailed records that capture variations in monsoon circulation. So here is a paper that was published a couple years ago by Hai Cheng and others. And this paper is titled "The Asian Monsoon Over the Past 640,000 Years." And what they've done in this remarkable work is they've pieced together speleothem records that come from these two caves right here, roughly at about 31 degrees north, Sanbao Cave and Hulu Cave. And the δ¹⁸O, the oxygen isotope concentration in the calcite speleothems from these caves, are thought to be a proxy for changes in the amount of rainfall or changes in the intensity of summer monsoon amplitude over South Asia and over Southeast Asia and South Asia as well. And here is their record in green. So you can see it's a very detailed record with very high resolution that in fact beats the I-scores in resolution in certain spots. And one of the best things about speleothems is that they're extremely well datable. You can use uranium-thorium disequilibrium chemistry to very precisely date speleothems. And an age model makes a paleoclimate record. And so a good age model makes a very good paleoclimate record. And so the Asian monsoon reconstructions that stem from these speleothem records have provided us a lot of insights into monsoonal circulation. But Cheng and others, as you can see here, they infer their record from these caves as the Asian monsoon. So basically, they assert that the variations that they see in their record are essentially also being reflected in the entire Asian monsoon domain. And so extrapolating this record or this inference to the initial I-score community inferences of methane, essentially they basically said that, well, now we have a really good record of monsoon intensity. And so that must be what's driving methane variations, particularly due to wetland variations across the Asian monsoon domain. So just to orient you with this busy figure right here, the green is the δ′O reconstruction from these speleothems, where a lower number, you can see more negative is upward, corresponds to more rainfall as per this interpretation, and a higher number or a more positive number that's below corresponds to a weakened Asian monsoon. And so the pink record that you can see on top of it is actually a record of insolation, so incoming solar radiation, at 65 degrees north during 21 June. So this is June insolation at 65 degrees north, which is the classic Milankovitch insolation curve. And so on top right here are the different components of orbital scale variation. So here's changes in obliquity, or the Earth's tilt, that goes from 24 to about 22.5 degrees. Here is precession, or the wobble of Earth around its orbit. And you can see that that goes higher here. Minus 0.4 is placed upwards. Positive 0.04 is placed downwards. And you can see that majority of the insolation variations seem to be controlled by precession. There's maximum correspondence there. And then in the yellow right here are changes in eccentricity, or how elliptical or circular the Earth's orbit is. So you can kind of think of this pink as the culmination of all of these three aspects. And this is in watts per meter squared in terms of the actual radiative forcing that is changing over the past 640,000 years. And for context, here is the benthic delta-18O record that's been used to infer past concentrations of ice volume or sea level here. So you can see that sea level is at about negative 120 meters during the glacial stages, and close to zero or slightly higher at the interglacial stages. But the major take-home message from these speleothem reconstructions is that the monsoon does not necessarily have this glacial interglacial beat. Instead, it seems to be driven solely by insolation and primarily driven by precession, this sort of 19 to 23,000 year beat, as you can see. It doesn't have this 100,000 year cycle that we saw earlier in methane as well. However, that being said, there are a lot of different interpretations offered for these delta-18O speleothems, and these include large-scale changes in atmospheric circulation over this region. This also includes sort of a trade-off between the westerlies versus the actual monsoon winds coming from the Indian Ocean. People have also inferred this to be having to correlate with changes in soil temperature. For now, I'm going to assume that this solely represents changes in some way or form of the strength of Asian monsoon intensity, which is the author's interpretation as well. And so then what the authors did, now we've only been talking on the orbital timescale, but what the authors did in terms of the millennial timescale, what they said was, hey, let's zoom in right here to the past 350,000 years. And they did this for the entire record as well. But just to give you an example, they said, hey, here are the green variations that are actual measurements, and they vary over the orbital timescale. And in pink is the actual insolation. So perhaps we can study the millennial-scale variability, all the fuzzies that are superimposed on these sine waves, by subtracting the pink from the green. And essentially, when you subtract the pink from the green, you get the blue. And so what they did with the blue is they then fitted the July insolation in orange on top of the blue. So it's a lot to take in, but here's June. They subtracted the green from the pink, just in terms of normalizing it and subtracting it, nothing too complex, to get the blue. They assert that the blue is a measure of suborbital variability because they've removed all the orbital variability, and hence we can focus on this millennial scale abrupt climate change. But then they actually correlate this to the orange, which is July insolation, a full month after June, but in the opposite direction. That's the kicker. So what they actually say is that essentially weaker monsoon times, these monsoon times, weak monsoon millennial scale times, you can see it's more positive delta-18O or weaker monsoon intensity, actually seem to correspond to higher insolation. So higher insolation, weaker monsoon. Lower insolation, stronger monsoon on the millennial timescale. And so finally, then when they took a spectra, so when they looked at this in frequency space, they essentially found that the pink and the blue, so you can see the pink and the blue, that the blue has 41,000 year timescale, 23,000 year timescale, 100,000 year timescale. Basically, the blue retains all of the dominant orbital frequencies that was originally in the record of insolation. And so The residual record after subtracting insolation had insolation frequency. So not only do they assert that orbital forcing and insolation controls the millennial scale variability, but they also say, they go a step further and they say that it is in anti-phase.
You've got 5 minutes left.
Oh, okay. So I've got to speed up here. So when they look at this sort of anti-phase relationship right here and going back to the Brook et al. Reconstruction, you can see that these two aspects are not consistent. So what I mean to say is that Cheng and others assert that modulation of monsoons on the millennial scale is anti-phase with insolation, and modulation of methane on millennial scales is in phase with insolation. So this doesn't necessarily add up if monsoons are driving methane. So I've given you a long introduction, and in the last 5 minutes here, I'm going to talk about the methodologies that we use to actually go in to disentangle these different aspects. And hopefully you've recognized that these are basically important considerations right here. So let's go up. I'm just going to speed up a little quickly here. But we should take a step back and say, what is modulation? So we essentially, people talk about modulation, but we wanted to look at this from a signal processing perspective. And the way that we wanted to infer this is from an amplitude modulation or a frequency modulation perspective. And essentially, the bottom line here is that a lower frequency or a higher periodicity signal modulates a particular carrier signal, and that results in an amplitude modulation. So in this case, orbital forcing is our modulator, the climate system is our carrier, and the paleoclimate record that we see is the eventual record that arises from amplitude and frequency modulation. So how are we going about to separate these aspects? Well, we have an algorithm here that I'm going to quickly skip over, but all of these algorithms and the steps are published in the paper and also on my GitHub, which I can provide a link to. But essentially, the way that we focus on modulation is by literally stripping this raw record of everything that we don't want to focus on initially. So we want to focus on the millennial scale variability. Here is the raw methane record going back 600,000 years. And here is its spectral, here is its spectra. And I've highlighted E, T, and P here. Basically, this is eccentricity at 100 kiloyear. This is obliquity. And here are the precessional peaks. So in the raw methane record right here, it has a 41 kiloyear peak, 100 kiloyear peak, which is quite evident right here, and a limited but small precessional peak. Now, our next step in our recipe is to basically filter this record to remove everything higher periodicity than the 10,000 year timescale. So by construction here, there's no power in the period greater than 10,000 years because I'm solely focusing on the 1 to 10,000 year band of variability. And then next, what we do is we separate out the envelopes of the high variability and the low variability right here. This allows us to look at the envelopes of millennial scale variability. And now we're able to fill back in this sort of concentration of variance because we're looking at the longer term changes in this high frequency millennial scale variability. So now I want to know if this millennial scale variability has any signals of eccentricity, obliquity, and precession. I cannot do it right here because by construction, I'm removing everything else. But now when I'm looking at the envelopes, I'm able to really ascertain and fill in these changes. And so this was the major surprise. So when we were able to combine these two and build a record, what we're calling the MMV, or the magnitude of millennial scale variability, the amazing thing to us was that the magnitude, the MMV of methane, contains a strong imprint of insolation, this 23 and 19,000 years. And so then we employed the same exact scenario for the Chinese cave composite. So there's that Chinese cave record of potential Asian monsoon intensity. And we see here that it's very strongly driven by precession. and a little bit of tilt, hardly any eccentricity. And when we look at the millennial scale variability, again, by construction, we're stripping away everything here. And now we're solely focusing on the envelopes. Let's see what that looks like. And we finally get our magnitude of millennial scale variability in this Chinese speleothem δ¹⁸O. And very interestingly, there is no precession signature to be found here. So precession, there is a slight obliquity, there's a large obliquity peak here. It's slightly outside 41, but there is no precession to be found. And so when we wanted to look at this in more in detail, here is a wavelet diagram. So trying to look at this in terms of the time evolution space. And so in the x-axis here in both cases are 640 years of time. In red is our MMV record of methane, and in yellow is changes in precession. And this wavelet, you can infer it as these yellower colors showing more correspondence or coherence between these two curves. And as you can see here, I've outlined precession right here, but also obliquity and eccentricity. And the arrows tell you the phasing of these two different curves. So your major takeaway from here is that the methane record is strongly coherent with precession. You can see this throughout in the precessional band. It is also coherent with obliquity. It comes and goes, but it's coherent. And it's in phase. So it's telling us about a direct process. On the other hand, when we take a look with the Chinese speleothem record, it paints us a different story. When we look at obliquity, where we did find that obliquity peak, we see that all of the arrows indicate that actually the δ′O signal leads obliquity. So obviously that tells you about some complexity in the Earth climate system, and that obliquity is not directly driving these changes in the millennial scale of the Chinese δ′O record. And moreover, most of this correlation is kind of low on the end, this wavelength. And that to us tells us that there is no necessarily periodic or significantly externally forced component to the millennial scale of these Chinese speleothem records. Okay, we tried to hunt for different records that we can do this exercise in, but this is simply not possible yet because we still need, these two are state-of-the-art records with exceptional dating and exceptional resolution. So we can't necessarily do this with multiple other records, although I do know that there are several new high-resolution records that are being built, which could potentially use this type of technique. And so the one last thing that I'm going to show you here is we were able to look at the MMV, or the magnitude of millennial scale variability, in Antarctic δD versus the magnitude of millennial scale variability in Chinese δ′O. And the major take-home message here is that this wavelet, there's a lot more yellow than blue, and all of the arrows are pointing towards the right. What that means is that they are very coupled. There's a close association between them. So this is a huge, huge thing because the Antarctic δD and methane come from the same archive and yet show completely different signals on their millennial scale. And in fact, the Antarctic δD shows a very good correspondence with Chinese δ′O records. So what's going on? And so our paper explores this. We also see an increasing trend in both of these records from about 430 kiloyears ago. I'm not going to focus on that in the interest of time, but I'm going to conclude here with the major take-home messages, and I'm happy to discuss in detail about what this might mean. But essentially, we cannot, basically, we have to conclude that there is something that makes for a decoupling between methane and Chinese δ′O on the millennial timescale. And the fact is that insolation directly modulates the millennial scale methane amplitude, but not the speleothem δ′O. And moreover, precession is in phase with methane, but it's not coherent nor in phase with the speleothem millennial scale variability. And so there are two scenarios here, and I'm going to end right here, but there are two scenarios. If speleothem δ′O if it's a rain gauge, I call the scenario one the rain gauge scenario. If speleothem δ′O is a low latitude monsoon record, then the methane modulation must come from somewhere else. Mid to high latitudes from southern hemisphere, from somewhere else. But on the other hand, if the speleothem δ′O record does reflect some type of large-scale atmospheric variability, which the link with Antarctic delta-T seems to show evidence for that, then we have to conclude that this analysis can't necessarily say anything about methane sources without additional records. And so that's where we're at right now. And I will stop right there.
Great, thank you so much for a fantastic talk. So as a reminder to everyone, you can send your questions in to the questions at Paleoperks host via the chat. And we have one question through. So are there any implications for wetland restoration or maintenance in the modern? Can this tell us anything about where efforts should or should not be targeted?
I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here for a second. I think my computer is very unhappy with all this stuff going on, but yeah, there we go. Okay, so that's an excellent question. I would say at face value that probably, the way that I'd answer that question is that we should put in efforts to build highly resolved reconstructions of tropical rainfall, monsoon rainfall, and changes in methane in the Pleistocene, because that really is going to tell us about the key processes about how future changes might occur in these wetlands. And so one way to really go about this is to try and reconstruct, get a better handle on wetland variations as well. There's another aspect here that there might be a decoupling between the amount of monsoon rainfall and actual wetland formation as well. So personally, I would put more stake into trying to develop longer term Pleistocene records than to directly infer anything about modern wetland management from these Pleistocene scenarios just yet.
Thanks. So one more through. Great lecture. Thoughts on why, even with the ice core MMV record, not all obliquity peaks correspond to MMV peaks. Also, is it possible to use stable or radioisotope traces of ice core methane to detect changes in dominant sources?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I had included in my previous talk, but was not necessarily, didn't make the cut here in the last couple of minutes here. But several people actually use, there have been a lot of papers in the last couple of years that have tried to look at changes in, say, for example, clumped isotopes or radiogenic isotopes to try and see where they can fingerprint the variations in methane are coming from. Unfortunately, we do not have the unprecedented detail that rivals the actual methane concentrations in terms of these different types of isotopic tracers. So it might be possible in the future to try and look at it, but there is a word of caution here. In these reconstructions, when you look at radioactive tracers, you can basically discriminate between geological sources and, say, wetland sources. But you're not necessarily able to distinguish between boreal wetland sources and tropical wetland sources, because they're both going to be younger radiocarbon signatures in the first place. So to answer your question, it is being developed. And I think we will have in the future more highly resolved reconstructions of these radioactive tracers and clumped isotopes. But you got to be careful in terms of what you're trying to look for, whether it's geological methane or whether it's actually different sources of methane coming from different latitudes.
We don't have any more questions. Oh, hang on, there's one in the chat. Have you already looked at the 120 kiloyear-old Julia ice record in northwest China, which δ′O matches the methane record of Gisp and Vostok, implying methane is modulated by the subtropical hydrological cycle?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a very good question. And this is one of the things that we're trying to push forward, is that just because there's a match between one record and the other doesn't imply modulation. Modulation, by definition, implies the control of how large the amplitude is in response to a lower frequency signal. So while you might have millennial scale changes all occur at the same time during the Younger Dryas, during Danskar-Ushker events, during Heinrich events, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not modulated differently. Okay, so just because there's a match, that doesn't necessarily imply that one is modulating the other. And so on that front, with respect to the Gulia ice core record, 120 kiloyears is unfortunately not enough to do this type of analysis on sort of the longer term timescale. However, it is a good idea to maybe look at things locally, say Northwest China, and potentially look at speleothem. So that is a good suggestion to try and look at that on the shorter timescale. But again, we got to be cautious that just because something matches in time doesn't necessarily mean that one is modulating the other.
Okay, great. So we're going to end there, as we've just hit the hour. And if anyone has any questions, when we transition into tea time practice, this will give everyone time to ask them. So we're just going to do a quick wrap up. So thank you everyone for joining us. Please remember to fill out our SurveyMonkey, so the link will be in the chat shortly so that we can learn a bit more about who attended today. And next week, please join us again to hear Emma Karoun present on open science practices in phytolith research and beyond. So now we have a quick break just before tea time. So this is a 2-minute break. So remember to get up, walk around, have a drink of water, come back in 2 minutes. And if you have paleo pets, please bring them to tea time as well. And we've got a little timer for you so you know when to come back. See you in a little bit.